This is TWiT.
Okay, so this was one of the most interesting stories of the week to me. We had the arrest of the Golden State Killer, serial killer from the 70s, 80s, and up into the 90s here in California. And the break in the case came when a detective who was assigned to the case, he was a cold case expert, decided to use some of the DNA from one of the crime scenes and created a fake account at a online DNA site called GED Match. It's an open source DNA website, and it looks to me like it's primarily used to find relatives for people who've been adopted or in some cases, people who want to find long-lost relatives. And you upload your DNA. They have a full disclosure that it's open source, that other people are going to be matching against you, and they can't control how your DNA is used and what results come back. And from this came a narrowing of the pool of potential families that the DNA from the crime scene matched. With that, instead of having millions of people to try and cross-reference, it ended up being that the detectives were able to narrow it down to a few family groups and just a few thousand people, and that's how they found the killer. They ended up narrowing it down to one suspect in that familial group whose profile matched, and then they picked up discarded DNA, which sounds to me like they went through his trash and ran DNA tests to see if there was a match. There was. And this was the person who was arrested and has been charged as the killer. So, open source DNA database.
Best
what kind
Black
of problems
Mirror episode ending ever.
Ending on a happy note.
That's right.
Lots of ethical questions here. It appears that this is legal. Given that people have willingly uploaded their DNA and that the match came from a third or fourth cousin of the man who was arrested. Thoughts? You know, you're opening up a can of worms when you do this, but and to be clear, this wasn't 23andMe or any of the other big sites who say they only respond to police warrants or subpoenas to have access to things like this. This was an open source database.
And the reason that people do this is because, so if you are on, like say Ancestry, it wasn't that, but let's say you're on Ancestry, you will only be, marked by other people that have gone on Ancestry. So by putting it online to an open source, all of the other people from other DNA sites can check to see what your genealogy may be. So you end up with a bigger set of data. So it's for people that are interested in finding out their genealogy, that's a good idea for them. But the problem is that, you're not just giving up your data like to a company that has a privacy policy, who knows if they're actually enforcing that, but you're now letting anyone be able to access your information.
Yeah, there's a pattern throughout history where we discover new technology and then we find out what the consequences of it are. And like with this, it's very mixed. Personally, for me, I'm adopted, and eventually one of these days I'm going to go get in touch with my birth mom. I'm going to meet her. I turned 40 this year. There's probably not a lot of time left to do that. But here you have something that very clearly could be used for a lot of really dark purposes, like not just overreach of law enforcement, not just like the idea of open sourcing your DNA. I think you'd have to be really careless to agree to that. It really speaks to the need for a regulatory environment with people that understand these issues and are willing to educate themselves on it. So yeah. It's both scary and good. I
totally agree with that on the regulatory part of this. I mean, I think this is like strangely connected for me, at least, to the Cambridge Analytica conversation, which is we're talking about personal data and how it gets used, right? And we're also talking about this idea, at least in this case, that like once you put your information out on the internet, it doesn't go away. And this has been there have been like all sorts of problems with this at the state level, people getting people getting things on their record as a minor and having that data be collected by the state, that information be sold by the state as part of a larger data package to a data broker company. And then when they become an adult, their record at the state level gets expunged, but this data that the state has now sold to another company is still floating around. And so I think, I know this. Maybe this all sounds a little like weird and vague, but I do really think that we need regulation at this when it comes to your personal data. And the FTC, I think, is at least in my mind the best place to start to think about that. But users, I mean, and eventually this will happen anyway. I think users just need to be super informed about the kind of data that they put out as an internet user, and I think that they need to be in more control of it. And I think that government is basically the intermediary to make that happen and to regulate, so that people can be more in control of their information. Obviously, this was a good story for solving the crime potentially. And it's, there are a lot of good things about this particular headline in the news, but I do think it connects to this larger issue of like data ownership and government regulation that helps individual users get that data ownership.